All right, good afternoon, everybody. Task Force members, thanks for coming back today. Really appreciate your continued commitment to this conversation in the city of Sioux Falls. We are missing a couple of members today. They had other conflicts, some other meetings in the community, but we'll continue on with our work today. A couple of reminders here. First, you'll notice on the agenda that public input is in a different place on the agenda today. So if you're joining us here in the room, just want you to be aware that public input is earlier in the meeting before we have conversation about our draft recommendations. And so the draft recommendations are on the podium over there if you'd like to grab a copy of those draft recommendations, because if you want to make public input on them, you can do that before we discuss them as a group. That will be the only time we have public input at our meeting, is at that point in the meeting. So please be aware of that. It will not be at the end of the meeting as normal. Second thing, just want to remind all of us task force members, I hope that you've been getting some comments in the community for serving and different things about the thing. I've had to remind a lot of people in the community that the task force did not start to end homelessness in our community. And so I feel like constantly need to remind all of us what True North is. True North is for us to identify tangible action steps that we can recommend to the council and the mayor that will take healthy steps as a community. We are being realistic. We're not a 50-page document, and we're not ending homelessness, but we're identifying healthy steps that we can take as a community. So let's encourage all of us to keep that in mind and encourage the community to keep that in mind as well. We're going to go ahead and get started today. We're going to begin with a real fun and educational experience. Our Chief Legislative Officer for the City Council, Jim David, is going to give us an overview of panhandling history in city ordinances. We've spent a lot of time on this in our research group. In our group as a whole, we spent some time on this. There's been a lot of conversation in the community about panhandling, and so felt take it better. Let's take a pause button here and get some historical understanding. I believe we also, the Chief is going to, I think Police Chief is going to join us. Chief is here today. Chief is also going to join us for questions as well, and open conversation as well after Jim presents the information. So Jim, take it away.
All right, good afternoon, task force members. The city's current panhandling ordinance was adopted the fall of 2012. It was a complete rewrite of the ordinance that had been in place since the early 1980s that had prohibited public begging. According to the current ordinance, soliciting from traffic is not allowed. There can be no direct exchange of money from a driver or passenger of a vehicle. Permission is required for a panhandler to operate on private property, but they are still prevented from entering into traffic. In addition to the ordinance, there was a community policing exercise in the spring of 2020 on East 10th Street at the I-229 interchange. Over a 3-week period, there were a total of 18 arrests, alcohol violations, disorderly conduct, with 2 of those arrests specifically for panhandling. The following year, panhandler signs were installed in various intersections throughout the city. Several cities and states around the country have attempted to restrict panhandling activity, only to have these laws invalidated by the courts. One in particular was Oklahoma City, which adopted an ordinance in 2015 to prohibit all but emergency use of medians on roads with speed limits of 40 miles per hour or higher, which affected more than 400 medians in Oklahoma City. The ordinance was litigated in federal court and declared unconstitutional by the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals on First Amendment grounds. The Supreme Court denied the city's appeal, allowing the Circuit Court decision to stand. The court stated in its opinion that medians are traditional public fora. According to previous case precedents, that streets and sidewalks were traditional public forums. Traditional public forums is defined as those locations that, quote, by long-standing tradition or by government fiat, have been devoted to assembly and debate, unquote. Examples cited include protests, charity drives, and political campaigns in city medians. The opinion also stated that governments may impose reasonable restrictions in public forums based on time, place, and manner without violating the First Amendment. The regulation must be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest and not burden substantially more speech than is necessary than to further the government's legitimate interests. The city had defended its ordinance, stating that it was based on pedestrian and traffic safety, But the court found that there was no evidence to bolster that argument. In fact, data showed that there was no accidents due to pedestrians and medians out of almost 40,000 accidents between 2010 and 2015. The court noted, however, that before its passage, city officials and others publicly mentioned panhandlers as the impetus for the ordinance. And finally, the court advised Oklahoma City officials to prohibit pedestrians from stepping into traffic, which the city of Sioux Falls currently has in place, which the city officials did dismiss due to its difficulty to enforce. The court responded that, quote, ease of application is not a sufficient reason to burden the First Amendment, unquote. Des Moines, on the other hand, as another case, Des Moines adopted its ordinance in 2019, and it prohibits anyone from standing, sitting, or staying in a median less than 6 feet wide at intersections where the speed limit is 30 miles per hour or higher. This ordinance, however, identifies specific intersections rather than just a general prohibition. The ordinance also includes safety data that's backed by the Iowa Department of Transportation. As of this week, the ordinance remains on the books. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Questions for Jim on the history of the ordinances? Jesse?
I'm sorry, not on history. On current standing of our ordinance.
Go ahead.
Okay, so Jim, as I understand it, we currently cannot solicit from traffic, right? So I can't stand out there and ask somebody to give me money.
You can stand out in a median and hold a sign. The city cannot dictate the content of that message on that sign.
Sure.
But you cannot enter into traffic to receive that money. And I'll look back at the chief to make sure I've seen this correctly. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. And then so I can't give money one way or the other, and I can have a sign that says whatever I want it to say.
Correct.
Okay.
You mentioned that there were 18 arrests for panhandling over a 3-week period.
Yes.
Here in Sioux Falls.
Yes.
What were they arrested for? Were they arrested for entering into traffic? Were they arrested for?
2 were specifically for panhandling.
Okay.
The other, there was 18 arrests. Most of those had to do with alcohol-related violations.
They just happened to be arrested in the place they were panhandling and were booked on an alcohol violation.
229 and 10th Street.
Okay, thank you.
Let's invite the chief forward too at this time. He can be available for questions and kind of have a free-flowing conversation. Do you want to make some opening comments? And then
I think Jim was going to get nervous if you ask him too many more questions about those procedures. But yeah, but
I like Jim to be a little nervous.
So back into that point, there becomes this gray area. Are they standing in the median to solicit for funds? Yes, but holding a sign is an exercise of First Amendment right. So therefore, it doesn't become a prohibited activity until that transaction takes place. But in doing so, to the 18 arrests, a lot of them are probably more disorderly conduct or alcohol fueled as opposed to panhandling. And if you look at it, especially the aggressive manner is a subjective terminology. So aggressive to cause public alarm or anything like that, which is why these ordinances are somewhat difficult to apply. And also in doing so, the courts within individual rulings have determined maybe what they would like to see from us and not see from us. And ultimately we work for, or we take the recommendations of the courts and some of how the way these laws and statutes are applied. And as you can see from Jim David's presentation, it's very cautious as to infringe upon that First Amendment right because we don't want to create bad case law. And so that's kind of just some context to some of these things. So we're going to err on the side of not violating somebody's rights and using more move-along techniques or, hey, let's not do that, and kind of use that as our means to kind of control that.
Other questions or comments for the chief?
Chief, you got any bright ideas?
After Caden's question, maybe.
And Jim, I know that you mentioned that they found I think it was Oklahoma City, you said that in the 4,000 accidents, panhandling didn't contribute to any of them. Was that right? Out of the 4,000 accidents, they found that panhandling wasn't contributed to any of those accidents?
40,000.
40,000. Chief, to your knowledge, have we had any accidents caused by panhandling in Sioux Falls?
Not that I can recall. What we do see, though, is especially in the neighborhoods that are affected by alcohol pretty heavily, especially Cliff Avenue corridor between 3rd and 10th, we have seen quite a few car pedestrian accidents. And typically those individuals weren't engaged in panhandling. They were moving across at inappropriate parts of the intersection at a time of night when light was diminished, and a lot of times under the influence of alcohol. And so if we look at different sections, which is why Des Moines, their approach is very useful, and I envision the police department and the street department with Public Works getting together and saying, let's do some studies of some of these intersections, let's mine the data, because we can look at it and say, especially like 10th and I-229, for example, very narrow median traffic, the speed limit's near 30, if not, it's traveled more with the intersection with a major interstate. It just is a high traffic area, which is why that particular activity is a little more on the dangerous side. But we have to make sure we construct these statutes with public safety in mind and not panhandling in mind, because then that gets into that area that's kind of gray as far as restricting, and the courts have been clear in their rulings on that. Bright ideas, is that what you wanted? And that's one of them.
You're the chief, right?
To take a more data-driven approach towards certain areas. But here's the other reality of this is I had was it last week, the privilege of being invited to Washington High School's AP class where they wrote essays on homelessness and the issues that are faced within that. I forwarded one to you, Councilor McCorris. You can look that over. What I appreciated from the high schoolers, which you hadn't really maybe would see before, is just their understanding of the complexity of this issue, not just from a panhandling front, but from a whole issue as far as homelessness goes. And if our young people start to understand the complexity of this issue, and there's not a silver bullet, that it's not as simple as just get a house or just get a job, right? Which we tend to take complex issues and make them very simple. I've noticed a shift within, I do a lot of speaking to the public. And if you would have talked about it years ago, it was a very simplistic conversation. If anything, the conversation is becoming more in-depth and more involved about really the realistic approach of what we can have, but also understanding that, like you said, Counselor, we're seeking to make inroads, make impact, and not necessarily look our way to enforce this away because people don't like to look at it. I just got back from the International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference, police from across the country talking about similar issues and the similarities of what we experience. And again, it's something that we, I think as a community, are at least having a really upfront conversation about and understanding the limitations and maybe where inroads can be made. So I think if you're looking for a positive, I can't find you a magic solution to make this, but I can say that we're at least having a conversation that's maybe more immature and informed than other parts of the country.
Other comments or questions? Terry?
Yeah, I think mine's more just a comment. I struggle with red tape and even understanding what all of the ordinances still mean. For me, I just see myself as a citizen who doesn't mind from time to time giving money to people who ask for it for my own reasons.
Yep.
But I guess what I'm wondering is, like, as this is all written, is there risk associated with a citizen like me who then just participates? Am I like helping them to break the law if I don't know how or when I should give money?
So realistically, you're participating in this activity, right? Can we find, is that the spirit of the law for us to be going out and taking people who are trying to do good and write them tickets? And that's what some people would call for, that there be tickets wrote to people who are giving money. We want to pursue the education piece really more than anything, which is why the signs have become somewhat polarizing. The reality is that we want to talk about it. We want to talk about the great things. We have a compassionate community who has proven time and time again that they will take care of needs between the banquet, the UGM, the Bishop Dudley Night Watch. I can name on and on. There's people providing food and to our community. However, the other part of the conversation is a realistic approach to what a lot of these funds are being used for, which is feeding alcoholism for a population and a group that really is struggling with it. So as long as we're bringing awareness to that, but again, I go back to, I was taught as a young person in college walking around the streets of Chicago, right? We were kind of behind panhandling here. Panhandling's been many other places. I was told by an older, wiser person, hey, if somebody asks you and you want to be compassionate, always offer to buy them food. If they take you up on that offer, you maybe understand their intentions. If they don't, they're probably doing some addict-seeking behavior. And so that's where the compassion meets. What we try to do too is just message and really highlight the good work that a lot of our community partners are doing in this area. And if people want to give funds and they want to give, there's other resources to do other than handing money. Because sometimes, I don't mean this literally, but a lot of times when money goes out the window, it's going straight towards that person's addiction and struggle that they're really, really working through. But again, people can be their own guides on how they do things. If they want to be compassionate, there's ways to be compassionate. And Sioux Falls and the surrounding community has shown that we are compassionate, unlike a few other parts of the country.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Any other questions? Chief, I have a couple. First, has your team identified any, like, outside, we're all familiar with 10th and Cliff.
Yeah.
And I-229.
229
and 10th.
Yeah.
Other spots outside of that your team is concerned about regarding safety?
Regarding safety, the safety is a lot of time where there's a median involved, and I understand exactly why some of these ordinances from other communities talk about that 6-foot median. The medians we see around 229 in particular are very thin and very narrow. A lot of the other panhandling activity we see is on off-ramps, right, where there is traffic's at a stop, right? People are looking for where there's the ability to have those funds transferred over. I've seen recently 41st and Louise, again, one of our busiest intersections in the state. And again, the activity moves 12th and Western. You can find different pockets at different places at different times. But if you're looking at some of our major thoroughfares, that's also where the most views and the most exposure can get, but it's also where there are some traffic concerns. But back to Oklahoma City's experience, we can't really say that there's a disproportionate amount of accidents related to panhandling. It's a concern, like a lot of things, but it's not that one we're saying, hey, this is an alarming trend at this intersection, or else, we have some more data. Maybe the street department does great work with cycling lights or doing different designs to slow traffic down. So that's a long answer for that, but.
And then kind of, you've already mentioned there's no silver bullet, but is there anything that your team desires in regards to have as tools in the toolbox for how you engage with individuals on the street? Or is there things, whether it be an ordinance, or whether it be resources that you could use that would help your team?
Pendulum swings certain directions, and what we're seeing with the trends with the courts right now and where they're interpreting certain things, it's a very open definition of the First Amendment. And we obviously as law enforcement want to respect the court's decisions and their guidance and where they're going, and we don't want to run afoul of that because officers often don't want to be named as part of bad case law, right? That's something that they seek and they desire. And that's the attorney's job too, from the city attorney's office and others, is to really say, what are the trends we're seeing in other parts of the country? How can we put our statutes so they really are effective? What would be interesting would be to look at some of our really habitual cases that are causing problems, and some of these individuals, and to make sure that they're getting resources funneled their way either through the court system or through other means, that we're really maybe having a more targeted response towards some of the people who are really struggling within our community, and really maybe rather than having a broad spectrum approach, really looking closely at individual cases. And as I've said before, in some other issues we've looked at, especially when it comes to homelessness, success is measured not by percentages but by individuals, and so to take that individualistic approach to see how we can support people and transition them from a community-wide standpoint. I'm not sure you can do that with ordinance. You can only do that with collaboration and a holistic look at the problem.
My final question is related. Southeastern Behavioral Health, they were here with us a couple of months ago, and they commented on a pilot project that they were doing with the PD. Was your pilot project with Southeastern Behavioral Health only in response to calls, or did you do any proactive approaching of individuals that were either panhandling or in parks with Southeastern Behavioral Health and your officers?
So when we ran this pilot project, they would go out and they would, if there wasn't a call that met the criteria list that they were looking for, they would go out with interact with certain people in the community. In fact, a community member stopped me just a couple weeks ago and was like, hey, I want to tell you how impressed I am with what I saw. This individual is standing out there holding a sign. I see a police car roll up. The officer got out with the Southeast behavioral worker and just engaged him in conversation, and they could tell just from being across the street the tone of the conversation and what was happening. And I think this is something, as we seek to expand our reach, that we're going to continue doing. We want to proactively go out, but also understand that there's room for that in a street team capacity, maybe outside of law enforcement. There's other areas or actors or things that can be done, and that's something you'll hear me advocate for, is a street team approach, or people getting out in the community, interacting, engaging with people where they're at, and maybe getting to the point where they need to be. But we will continue this project and move forward on it. And we just had a meeting a couple weeks ago with Southeast to talk about how we can expand it and build on it. Because at a time when staffing is obviously very difficult, this is something that we need to keep building from. But again, sometimes there's a lot of pressure to roll out a fully functional program that covers 24/7, 365. Sometimes we have to be content with a foothold that we can build from. And I think that's with a lot of problems. Get a stance, get some momentum, and then build from there. And that's what we want to do with this program.
Great. Another question, Caden?
We also met with the Link a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And one of the statistics that they shared with us that really shocked me was that in 2021, 40% of the sobering center visits came from 10 individuals.
Yeah.
Which did not surprise me, to be honest, but it's because I've worked with that population. I'm very certain that those 10 individuals are also well known by your departments, and I'm sure that your officers work to build rapport with those community members. Are you seeing consistent faces at those locations panhandling? How often are we seeing new individuals participating in that, or is it kind of the same old people that we expect to see?
So you start to see the same people, but when new people show up, you kind of take note of it. Now, I've been off active patrol now for a couple of years, seems longer, but time moves quick. But you would see at different parts of town, like, hey, we don't recognize them as some of our usual customers, our usual people who are in town. Wonder where they're from, wonder where they're at. You see that sometimes on the outskirts of town, or more towards the central core parts of town. You start to see people that you recognize from your day-to-day activities and your day-to-day work. And I think it's worth pointing out that the individuals, this is their community. These are their friends, this is their social circle, this is where they feel a sense of belonging. So it's not uncommon to see people who are panhandling, sharing in what they get and working together. I pulled up in an unmarked car the other day and watched a couple who were panhandling dole out what they got together and then move on their way. And so there's a sense of community within that as well, which is why if we can make inroads within that community as a whole and find people and find ways to impact them and make some progress towards the mental health and the alcoholism and some of the other substance abuse issues that are there, maybe there's a great opportunity to make inroads in that community.
And then I had one more question. Sorry, Rich. With the idea of a street outreach team, do you think, and this is just speculation at this point, but do you think it best serves this population to be approached by a police officer, or do you think that elicits some initial combative feelings? Do you think it would be better to have them approached?
So, case in point, law-abiding citizens, when a police car gets behind you, what happens?
You slow down.
Slow down, right? And I can tell you, it happens to everybody, right? There's a certain sense of, oh, hey, there's the cops. Like, behavior gets changed, how you act changes a little bit. I kind of equate it to, even if you're doing everything right, it's like when you get called to the principal's office, he could be giving you an award, right? But at the same time, you're like, what's going on with this? And so I think there's space within this for a non-law enforcement intervention. And I think sometimes further inroads could be made if law enforcement wasn't the initial encounter or the front door to that system. And so I've said throughout my time as chief, we are more than welcoming other people to this space. Again, by having this task force and this commission and this idea, we're acknowledging that this issue resides outside of law enforcement's, I mean, it is in our realm, but it's not solely our realm, and I think that's where we're getting. So if you'd see from us, again, always wanting people to be safe and encouraging safety, but recognizing that that doesn't necessarily have to have a uniform law enforcement response to be effective.
Thank you.
Any final questions?
Just one more. I seem to have noticed more activity at 10th and Phillips as of late.
Yep.
On the Coffea side of the street. Really, over the last year, has your team noticed, your downtown folks?
Things have ebbed and flowed within that region. People have kind of come and gone. We've seen within Phillips. Phillips is probably one of the most patrolled streets in Sioux Falls, just because of where it lies. People come through regularly on regular occasions. So we kind of have a good understanding. We had an officer assigned to Phillips Avenue for the majority of the summer. We had a pretty good take. And we see people, again, come and go. This summer, I think we mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned this in previous meetings, I had the opportunity to travel to Florida and back by car, stop in major cities throughout our country, and observe similar, but on a much higher scale, the type of panhandling in downtown areas. And so I would say there definitely are things that rise up, and that's where I see a good opportunity for a street team approach, where we see people. I know the downtown DTSF ambassador does a good job of saying, hey, how can I help you? Here's some different ways we can go. So I think, again, an approach, if law enforcement approaches, it becomes a different tenor, right? It is a different set of governing rules, principles, and laws based off our encounter. Sorry, haven't hit the mic before there. So yeah, I think it's something that we've seen ebb and flow throughout the years, and we'll continue to see.
Great. All right. Thank you, Chief. Really appreciate your participation.
Yeah, thanks for your time.
He'll be available, I believe, for other questions as we move forward as well. Second item here. No, not right now.
Not right now.
No.
Rich, just whatever you need.
You can hang out at the mic if you want all day. But second is winter preparedness update and overview. Carrie Benz from the county is unable to be with us. I believe she was going to send a partner in crime. You want to step forward maybe? I'm going to share some things that Carrie had sent me, and then you could answer any questions. Or you just want to give the update, and then I can introduce yourself and your partner.
She had said that she had sent out the notes to all of you from the winter preparedness meeting that Minnehaha County Human Service. Oh, yep, Lori Montes, Minnehaha County Human Services. And so each fall we host a winter preparedness meeting, and a lot of the frontline staff come to that meeting and share kind of what they've been seeing, what their plans are for the winter weather, in hopes of trying to provide a safe environment in our community for the winter months for our homeless population. And so if you had a chance to look at the notes, you could see that I don't think there was a whole lot new necessarily shared during this year's meeting that happened a month or so ago. Probably the two biggest agencies that we really look to for help in this area are the two shelters, so Bishop Dudley and the Union Gospel Mission, in trying to get people placed and out of the elements if the weather is not safe to remain outdoors in. And so we really tried to get some details from both of those agencies as to what kind of parameters they follow for when the weather gets bad. And so you can see that Bishop Dudley shared that their main check-in time is between 6:30 and 8 p.m. After that, they do make exceptions, but they really like people to call ahead or perhaps have law enforcement make that outreach call to get people placed there. And the UGM is pretty similar, actually, in kind of their guidelines. Their time is just a little bit different. They prefer check-ins between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. Because that's when they have or hope to have case managers on site. And then it's a hard stop for them at 10 p.m. for new admissions. Although, again, they shared that they will allow people that are escorted by law enforcement in instances where they're needing an individual needing some shelter. One of the challenges I think that we see is when it's not an individual, right? So when it's a family who's homeless, that's when we really struggle with the placement issue. And so Minnehaha County has an on-call system, right? We answer calls from 5 p.m. to 8 a.m. the following morning and all weekend. And the bulk of those calls really are for shelter, and so we'll refer to Bishop Dudley or Union Gospel Mission. Now, sometimes the person's not allowed to be there for different reasons, whether they've been officially trespassed from the facility or just have been asked maybe not to come back for a period of time. And so we do have motel rooms that we try and put people in, and especially families, and so we actually have 5 motel rooms that we utilize on a regular basis for that are full and have been full. So unfortunately, as we're heading into winter, we don't have some of those options available for them at this point anyway. So we're really looking to see how we can better partner and maybe how we can work better with the shelters to try and utilize some of that space to meet that need.
Great, thank you. A couple of items that Carrie had passed along, and that, just make sure I'm stating it correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong. Then Jim will share with everybody here the notes from the winter preparedness meeting, so you can see that. 2 items I think that were of note. One is Bishop Dudley Hospitality House now has live information on their website of exactly how many individuals have checked in, so a special thanks to the helpline, getting that turned around quickly. That's important for the police department as they're determining where they can take an individual, and so that's in place for Bishop Dudley. I believe that Carrie said she's going to be in conversation with the other agencies over this next week to see how we can fast track to get that in place for the other ones as well, so that a county case manager can try to make contact with the other agency if they get a phone call, and if the county case manager has that information at their fingertips, that helps them in making a determination as well. So Bishop Dudley, I believe, is step 1, and there's some other steps to take there, but a real big thanks to Bishop Dudley and the helpline for making that available to the community, and I know they both fast-tracked to make that happen. Second thing that I think is really important to note is Carrie's meeting on Thursday, I believe, of this week, with some key individuals from Bishop Dudley, St. Francis House, and maybe a couple of other places, specifically talking about the 30 to 40 individuals that are consistently creating an issue or are challenged to be housing because they've either had a trespass placed against them or something out this place. And then Carrie said that she could follow up with us next week on where that conversation went. And then the final thing that Carrie wanted me to express was, and it's going to come in our draft piece as well, there's been a lot of conversation in this group and then in this community, a lot of conversation about, we've got a lot of things in the works right now. Do we need the potential of another warming shelter during the winter months and to help in this time? And Carrie wanted me to express, and I believe she said I could say very strictly what she said, is that she said, I cannot support this. She believes that we need to focus all discussions on working with the existing shelters and helping them do their best that they can do and assist in tooling them with the support that they need at this time. That funding another shelter option at this time would create longer-term consequences that are not helpful for their effort. So she said that I could share her perspective on that, and she's obviously open to conversation on that in the weeks ahead, but she expressed the desire to have some more time working with the helpline on the live information and the winter preparedness team as well. So just that's Carrie's perspective, and wanted to share that as well. Does that feel like that summarizes what she's working on?
Absolutely, yep, I think that's right on target.
So thank you. Any questions for the county and their work? Andy?
Yeah, Lori, I don't know if you're in a spot to answer this, but I'll just kind of say it for the group. I recall Bishop Dudley talking about hitting capacity limits quite a bit last winter, and those limits will be a lot less. It seems like that's the shelter that's continually at capacity. He talked about 5 hotel rooms that are not full. What would the county do if Bishop Dudley staff called and said, we're full? Because that's my concern of not getting after this new alternative is we better have another partner step up, and I just haven't seen that. Do you have any thoughts on that, or is that a question for Carrie?
I think I can answer that at least to some extent, and that is those 5 motel rooms are ones that we have prepaid, and so they are available for us and for the clientele that we choose to house there. We also have other hotels that we work with throughout the city, and so what happens then if we get a call from somebody and those rooms are full is starting down the list and making all those calls to try and find a room available for the person that's needing shelter. So it can be a time-consuming, and we've had a couple times, honestly, this summer where we had to just say, we don't have any rooms. There weren't any. All of the, available rooms in the city were being utilized by, other people that were here working and, here for events and all of that kind of thing. So that's been a challenge for sure.
And Caden.
Yeah, I talked with Madeline a few weeks ago. She anticipates them hitting 180, 190 individuals attempting to spend the night there, and that's 25 more than they are legally allowed to have there. So I guess what I am wondering if you can walk us through the process. If somebody wants to check in at the Bishop Dudley House, they are number 156. They can't be let in. Is there a 24/7 county person that is going to take that call at 9 p.m. and is going to facilitate getting a motel room for that person? We use up all those motel rooms. There's no more in the city. What is the, at what point does the Bishop Dudley House, I don't think they do have discretion to, go over what the fire department has given them in terms of numbers. I'm terrified that we are going to see somebody freeze to death this winter. And I have yet to hear a solution to that from anyone, not just from you, Lori. I'm not
Right. Yeah.
right. I have yet to hear a sustainable option for us when it comes down to the wire.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what those conversations need to include is what are we going to do when that happens, because I think we can count on that happening. And one piece of that, I think, is trying to utilize the UGM better because they have not been at capacity historically. And so I think there is some room there. And so hopefully we can get something in place to help them fill in and meet some of those needs.
Maybe go ahead, Mike.
That kind of brings up two concerns that I kind of have. First of all, everybody these days is talking about inflation. And the price of those motel rooms that you have on standby, those that you need additionally and so on, are probably going to be leading to increased costs. Another thing that has not been brought up, excuse me, is that at one time it was said that Amazon was going to be putting off for 2 years. Now, the information that I've received is that Amazon's going to be hiring 140, 150 people per week and hope to be completely staffed, 1,500 people by the end of February. In that particular situation, we're going to have an influx of people coming into Sioux Falls. Not necessarily all of them, well, if they won't have a job, more than likely, and may contribute to our homeless population during that winter cold period time span. And that's something that, again, no one's brought up. Again, earlier on, it was like it was supposed to be 2 years. Now it's pretty much the onset of a morass of people, or at least an influx into the city, which is a fairly large influx.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing your perspective. Any other questions for the Marshall?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Remind me of this again. It's always the Bishop Dudley stories that really get down to the nuts of this subject, and especially when Madeline tells these stories about full capacity and that. So there's 5 hotel rooms, or with a certain hotel, that if you're turning somebody away, they go there. And then there's, if it gets to that point and those are maxed, there's somewhere else to go. I mean, how many times has it come where somebody's actually had nowhere to go?
Fortunately, it hasn't been often over the summer, but I think I can think of maybe 2 or 3 instances this summer where we had to say, we have nowhere to put you. There's no rooms available. And so, you know, sometimes it's people who showed up in town with no plan and hoping that they could connect to some service, but it just has not been there. So I would say like 2 or 3 times this summer that happened.
And the capacity of that, and again, Madeline, I'm sorry if I'm giving you questions that should maybe go elsewhere, but so the capacity of that, Bishop Dudley, again, is what? And usually it's about 20% over. It sounds like every time she tells a story, we're fitting people down the hallways and this and that. I mean, how many people are generally in there?
She reported at this meeting that the capacity of Bishop Dudley is 155 individuals, not including the 7 families.
And that, sorry, I just want to comment, that is well above what it should be. There's 80 beds for men and 20 for women and 7 family rooms. 155 individuals is the Bishop Dudley House completely putting all the tables down in their day rooms and laying down floor mats, if they even have 155 floor mats, if not just blankets, so that people are on the floor. They're not even, that's not even sleeping in a bed.
And did I understand it? Sorry, one more question.
Oh, you're fine.
If I could. So, and Carrie's recommendation was, if I heard this right, no more rooms or building something additional or whatever, let's focus on what we have, or how did I hear that part?
Yes, I think her perspective or her comment was related to trying to set up another shelter just because of all of the challenges that go with that. It's, you know, that's one of the hardest things to do is to house homeless people. And I think trying to get, you know, well-meaning, a lot of times people that step up and want to do something just ends up not working out for the best. So I think it really is trying to maximize the effective use of the facilities that we have, which again, I think the biggest one is UGM. That does have a lot of space.
Okay. So I think just to follow up, probably a little context, I think one is the Bishop Dudley's been sending me updates each morning, whether that's good or bad over the last 10 days. And 3 times over the last 10 days, they've already been over the 155 number. And Bishop Dudley, whether to their credit or I'm not sure how to phrase it, has not necessarily gone in and said, you're out. Partially the conversation that Madeline and I've had is putting a staff member in that situation of having to say to somebody, 156 units. I think I don't know if we'd all agree on that or not, but that's a tough spot to put an individual. We're having a hard time staffing anyhow, of having a staff member make that determination. And so what Madeline and I have talked about in regards to that, her comment about funding a warming shelter was really around churches, for example, have come forward at different times and said, hey, we'll open up. And what's happened is churches haven't realized the complexity of saying, we'll house 30 people here, because usually the 30 people that show up are the most difficult 30 people. So it sounds good like, hey, we'll open up our room, throw some cots out and so forth, but the challenge and the difficulty is extreme. And so the conversation that Carrie made clear to me was like, hey, let's really double down here on this winter preparedness thing over the next couple of weeks and see if we can make some ground with Union Gospel Mission on live numbers. And if we can increase that, I think it's become clear in here in this conversation, you know, in 2 weeks from now, if we don't have a better process with Union Gospel Mission on how to handle over 155, then I think we have to come back as a group and say, you know what, we might have to have another conversation because we don't want to put a staff member in that situation.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. Thank you. And
Let's
Lori,
go over to
thank you for
Jesse and then we'll come
stepping in
back.
here tonight.
We'll come back to Andy. Jesse, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. We had a board meeting last Wednesday, and just to reiterate exactly what Rich said, on October 12th, we had guest 156 show up. And the reality is our staff, you don't work at a homeless shelter to turn people away. And it's just not in their DNA. They're not going to do it. And so what they asked them to do is to stand outside. And we have folks throughout the night that get up and leave for whatever reason, whether they're restless, they can't sleep, they have anxiety about sleeping in those crowds. And then we'll let people come in and take their spot. But it is exactly as Caden said, we're a facility for 100 people, and and we are at guess 156. And so while we can say we don't want to open another warming shelter, I believe we need to take a hard look at what our choices are and really figure out what's best to do that. I didn't see Carrie's notes, so I would appreciate maybe perhaps getting them from that meeting. But I can tell you that Madeline's staff do not have the heart to turn people away, but we don't have anywhere for them.
Yep. Andy.
Just a comment, and I understand this is impossibly hard, so I'm not here to beat up on any entity, but we've heard about these numbers for like a couple months, and it's getting colder and colder, and we're still exploring options. And Madeline asked, please don't put my staff in that spot. And we're still holding out that a partner will show up at the table. So I don't want to say things to break up the potential of partnerships, but I think we have to act quickly out of fairness to the Bishop Dudley House. It's already a heavy lift what they carry when they're below that number. And I think we have to be realistic about what other options we really have.
Thank you. Everybody kind of in agreement. Let's give Carrie the next 10 days here to continue those conversations. Jim will circle back and put a note on his calendar to update us all in 10 days, so forth, and at our next meeting, reconvene that conversation if necessary. Annie?
I just have something really quick. So I think just as a PSA, maybe it'll drum up more business, but there's only a handful of motels in the city that will accept the county's call. So that is another factor. It's not, we have the pool of every hotel in the entire city. We don't. It's a small group of hotels that will accept a voucher from the county. So I think the big void here is, and we've been dealing with it, since I started at county, which was 18 years ago. I started at county, and it was, it was kind of a joke, but it was I wish the homeless shelters would actually take the homeless, because there was a void of certain people that wouldn't be allowed in to certain places. So, and I feel like we've all kind of danced around that subject a little bit today, but that's a big part of this.
All right. Thank you for coming today and stepping in. Really appreciate your
Yes.
willingness to be here.
You're welcome.
At this time, I want to open it up for anybody from the public to come and give public input on anything we've talked about today or the draft recommendations we're going to be discussing in just a moment. So any members of the public wish to address the task force, you can have 3 minutes to share your perspective. Any members of the public? Going once, twice? All right, sold. Draft recommendations before you, task force members. At our last meeting, we kind of laid out a framework trying to say, hey, what can we start to pull together here as specific things we can recommend to the council or the mayor for consideration. Each of you had an opportunity over the last couple of weeks to email your thoughts, perspectives, ideas, and so I thank you for calling or emailing, texting, snail mail, whatever it was that you sent your messages. Appreciated that and had a lot of conversation with many of you over the last couple of weeks. What I tried to do is summarize all that information together, make tweaks where I heard tweaks, and then I tried to kind of summarize this into 3 different areas. One, recommendations where I feel like there was a majority of people saying, yes, would agree with this. Again, not unanimous, but majority. A second portion where there was maybe not a majority, but there was kind of a different segments saying different directions. And then the third area of things we know are issues that we need to be aware of, but there's already ongoing things happening in the community, and we want to respect those conversations that are already happening. So what I want to do today was just walk through each of these, give an opportunity for open comment or question about them. Our goal then would be to leave this meeting over the next 2 weeks, take more feedback thing. At our next meeting, we'd formally adopt them or recommend them to the mayor or the council. So no formal vote today. We'd prepare for that at our next meeting. The first item on here that's potential draft recommendations is to promote an intentional, proactive, and healthy approach to engaging with the homeless. 2 council actions would be 1, develop a professional services contract with a selected organization for a 2-year pilot project of street outreach team. What this comes from is examples in other communities that we've heard of, researched regarding kind of what the chief of police already mentioned, sending non-law enforcement individuals on a proactive basis to interact with people in our community who are struggling. What I've tried to do over the last couple of weeks is specifically talk with governments, 4 different cities: Rapid City, Denver, Salt Lake, and Tulsa. Each of these communities has something very similar to a street outreach team. Each has a little different approach to how it's done, whether it's in a nonprofit, whether it's part of the city, wherever it might be. So I tried to talk to each one and get some overarching themes that they had recommended. And the overarching theme that was kind of recommended was make sure that you start strong enough where you can make a big enough impact over the 2 years to really make a judgment on the effectiveness of the program. So for example, they kind of unanimously said, hey, don't start this thing where you just have it on Friday nights from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. and then look back in 2 years and say, well, that didn't really work at all. Make sure you put enough effort forward. And so where the financial numbers came from was in talking with each of those cities on how much they spent, kind of averaging that out for our size of community and so forth, recognizing that I'm not recommending here, and how this task force conversed about it, the city's not taking on the full cost. We're expecting whichever entity that we partner with is also taking on a major portion of the cost, but the city is putting enough funds forward that would allow us to have some say in the makeup of the program. So in regards to that, there's been a couple of things that have really stuck out. Number 1 is making sure it's a peer support strategy, making sure that there's lived experience when we have individuals going out and interacting with individuals that are in the community. Secondly, in our community specifically, something that maybe we haven't talked about openly, but I know that many of us have had conversations behind the scenes. Annie, please correct me if I'm wrong on this. The most recent statistics that I've received, at least from the state, is that 78% of our homeless community in Sioux Falls is Native American population. And so in recognition of that, I believe we can all recognize that that's disproportionate to our community population. We want to partner with an organization that has Native American experience. And so I want to make that a key element of it, a requirement of the contract. And then the third item would be making sure that whoever we partner with is part of the helpline network of care. It won't make a lot of sense for us to enter into a contract with someone that's not part of the helpline network of care, plus set up a fund and be encouraging people to be in the helpline network of care. So it should be part of the contract. And so that's the general thoughts at the moment, is that those dollars that go forward in a contract would require those elements to be a part of it. So questions, conversation there. Jesse.
I really think that this is going to be a great first strategy to come out of this. And I do feel that that lived support from people who have perhaps been in this exact same situation cannot go far enough to hopefully making some key strides. The Bishop Dudley House is part of the Helpline Center's network of care. That's how we've got to where we've got a real live number of how many beds we have available. There is a downside to this, however, and it's that the state HMIS dollars, these two systems, network of care and HMIS, do not talk to each other. And it's not because of I think a desire of any one organization or another, but HMIS is bound by the federal government to use their system and their vendor. And their vendor, no matter how well-intentioned we are, they don't want to have any crossover. They don't want to allow any access to perhaps compromise their system. And we had specific conversations because our partners at the Bishop Dudley House early on encouraged us to work with the Helpline Center to become a part of the Sioux Empire Network of Care. So we did have live, real-time numbers as best we can about the people that are and the guests that are staying with us. So while we think it's a great system, We are glad to be a part of it and have been a part of it for a long time being 7 years in our business, but there's a downside too. And if, all the parties are getting the money, there's got to be some sort of link to make it easier, because we only have so many resources at the Bishop Dudley House, and we cannot spend 20 hours a week taking the data that we are getting from the network of care and entering it into the HMIS system, and that's what's happening right now. We have to take all of that data and enter it into their system, and we could use those hours better spent serving people.
Thank you. Good thoughts. Annie, go ahead.
So we actually had a conversation with 211 and the state about being able to share the data and connect the databases. 211 can explain more of the details a little bit better because they're working with the state or the federal government on some things that they can explain it better than I can. But let me just tell you that it sounds like we're headed towards connecting the databases, or at least being able to share the information. So.
Let's not put that in the minutes. But yeah, Terry.
So mine is a comment, and bear with me. I'm really struggling with words because this is a tough conversation to be a part of for me. It just brings up a lot of my own experiences. And so when hearing about the peer support piece of it, I celebrate that all day long. And I want to say that also those same peers that we identify to help out with like the street outreach team is the same type of peers that could be called upon to help supervise a warming shelter. So, Rich, when you're talking about the complexity of the issue and churches opening up and realizing that it's messy, it's going to be messy forever. Whoever opens their doors, there's going to be a mess to clean up the next day. But what happens is when people who share in that experience, they don't find it so challenging or disturbing to participate in that type of work. And so as I'm sitting here thinking about where in proximity could we have guest 156 to whomever get somewhere, I'm trying to envision what that looks like. If it's a shuttle bus, someone getting sent somewhere. But then I just thought to myself, could it not be possible that our Coliseum is then opened? Because in the homelessness, they use the gymnasium style for warming anyway. It's not that we need a very infrastructure-based place. You just need a gymnasium. So is it not feasible to consider that we could have peers supervising the Coliseum and then actually have something close in proximity where another 40 people could be placed for the night, and then the place can be cleaned up in the morning?
That's great thought, and I appreciate the overarching kind of peer support focus. Let's keep the thought on the shelter option. Keep that in your mind for over the next couple of weeks as we continue that conversation. Thanks for reinforcing the peer support. Anything else on the street team specifically option here? Caden.
I noticed that the chief left us, unfortunately, but maybe you had a chance to chat with him. Has he heard about this? Is this something that, I want to know his thoughts on it.
I may not want to put words in his mouth, but was one of the original ideas of encouraging us to talk to the Journey On group in Rapid City.
Yeah,
was the chief.
I think his earlier comments reflect that this is something he would be in approval of. I just wanted to confirm that. So,
Mike.
First of all, I think the approach is excellent. Secondarily, I like the idea of a 2-year pilot program. The only thing I would interject along that line is that I don't know if we'd get the same group or what have you, but I'd like to see what is transpired be reviewed at a 1-year point of time I'd be more than happy to be a part of that. And I guess we need to know how things are going to have progressed from the decisions that we make.
Great point. Probably, I mean, should put some objective things in here that we'd be looking for to happen over those 2 years. Good point, Mike. Jesse?
Rich, in your visit to Journey On, what metrics do they keep for number of individuals encountered and placement and that sort of thing?
The number one metric that they've kept is on the reduction of 911 calls. So their system is a tinge different. They are integrated into the 911 system in Rapid City. Maybe you've seen the news recently, but over the last year, they've lowered 911 calls specifically for individuals by 1,500 calls, which is a significant reduction in that area. I know they've got some other objective criteria, to be honest, but I don't have that. My focus was more on looking at the training of the individuals and kind of how that, and the peer support aspect. Go, Jesse, you have a follow-up there?
Yeah, I would just agree. It's a lot of money, but it's probably not nearly enough money to go to one agency to make a big impact. Because I look at, I mean, this is a big number. Bishop Dudley doesn't get anywhere near that kind of dollars from the city. And I'm not saying we want to do this, because we do not. But I think that we need some measurable metrics and outcomes, and what are some expectations of interaction and hours of interaction and nights of interaction, and I'd like to see it happen more frequently, perhaps once a quarter in that initial year, because I wouldn't want us to wait for a year before we make some changes if it's not working.
Great feedback. Caden?
And this is just my own ignorance, but how would we go about, would it be possible for us to integrate this into the metro system the way they did in Rapid City? Or, because I know when we discussed it, we discussed having a specific number that would go directly to that organization, but I'm wondering if there's a way we can circumvent that.
Great question. At this point in the conversations, at least what the feedback that I've gotten back is our system is, we're in a little different situation than Rapid, for example, in that we've got 4 counties. Wish the chief was here so I don't say something I'm not supposed to say. We're integrated in 4 counties, so there's a level of complexity there of how that piece works, and we don't know if that'd be like a tomorrow able thing. We might be able to move quicker if we were acting outside of that, but that's not like a finalized piece at all. It's just been, this has all just been conversation. Other questions on this one specifically, or things, we'll work on some objective things and make sure that gets included in this item. Terry.
I just also want to voice a full support of it and really talk about how the proactive piece is super imperative too. When you're talking about measurements of success and those different type of things, when you are ensuring that it's proactive and not just reactive, then during that proactive time, you can actually help with the coaching and mentorship that moves them in transition out of homelessness into the other resources that they need. So I just really appreciate seeing that proactive intention explicitly expressed.
Great. The second council action here under this specific one was creating a public education campaign to help people understand the challenges of homelessness. Where this came from is the SMILE research team that we had of Caden, Annie, Mike, Terry, in conversation with the link with Urban Indian Health, and further conversation was the recognition that there's a lack of understanding in our just in any community. There's a lack of understanding of maybe why people are homeless or what's the best way to help, the best way to express compassion. And so would there be a value in trying to improve education of our community overall? And then Annie's had some conversation that there's other entities as well that potentially are looking at a public education campaign. Could we do something in partnership with them? So this again would be an emphasis on helping the community understand what's the best way they should participate. This would partially go hand in hand with the street outreach team of encouraging people that if they are interacting with a person, that they'd reach out to call Andy at 1-800-ANDY, and Andy will send out the street team or whatever, just encouraging them that one way of how they would engage in that. So that's where the initial recommendation kind of came from right now. Questions, ideas, comments on that overall? Marshall.
Mr. Chair, so Talk to me again a little bit about, I love the idea, but who is on this campaign? I mean, and it all sounds terrific, and I think it will be, but who's on this board, or who's teaching us this and walking us through, and what is this 125 grand going, where all is it going? And
We have not gotten to that level of detail.
okay.
Outside of saying we want to have a public education campaign.
Okay.
In early conversations with the administration has indicated a level of support, saying that we could use some of the administrative staff with the city to help put together a campaign. If some members of this community wanted to serve as volunteers to help develop the materials of it, we could use some of the administration staff for the help of delivery on it. But it's got a lot more detail to get into specifics on it overall.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you.
Jesse.
I do really like the idea of replacing our current signage with a QR code that we can encourage consumers to, there can be a laundry list of things that they can do to reach out to support. They can give, they can call for help for specific individual, for mental health support, there's a place they can call. It's going to take some resources to have a one-stop shop, for instance, but I think it is a very proactive approach, and something I think that ultimately could get turned around fairly quickly, and I think it's one of the best actions, frankly.
Caden.
So thank you for saying that, Jesse, because I love this idea so much, and I'm really happy it made it to our final draft recommendation. Marshall, yes, when you were kind of walking through what does this look like, when I visualize it, I'm thinking about billboards specifically in the downtown area. I would love to see the removal of the panhandling signs. I want all of our community members to be treated with dignity, and I just don't know if those signs make them feel very dignified. But I also know that community members, while they might not want to participate in panhandling by giving money to individuals, they want to feel like they're doing something. And so if we are able to call this number to help somebody who might need assistance, or scan this QR code to learn more about homeless resources in our city, I think that is going to have this huge impact, and hopefully in partnership with a pilot program, right? But I think ultimately the vast majority of individuals who live in Sioux Falls and who are seeing these homeless community members, I think they want to do something. I think so many people don't know what the first step is towards doing something. And so when I think about that public education campaign, that's kind of what I envision.
Mike.
The other thing is too, that would, per federal FCC communications, another outlet could be radio and television on their public announcements.
Great. Other feedback, comments? Annie?
Can I just, I know we're probably on a time crunch here, but.
I'll tell you if you get long-winded.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to tell this story because I think it's important it's kind of a cherry on the top for all of this that we've just gone over. After one of these meetings, I was driving home and there was a man, he was unconscious and he was laying on his back with his head propped up against a pole, and he had a sign that said help. And so I decided I didn't want to call the police because I've done that before, and well, it's kind of a waste of resources sometimes. But so I stopped, I pulled over, and I just went up to him and I was like, "Are you okay? Do you need me to call an ambulance?" And he came to, and he just kind of smiled at me, and I was like, "Do you need an ambulance?" And first he said yes, and then I think he was kind of embarrassed, and then he changed his mind. And I said, "Well, are you hungry? Do you want to go across the street? Frying pan?" He's like, "Yeah." So we went over there and sat down and had a meal together, and he shared a lot of personal details about trauma and addiction and a lot of different things. And I feel like, we're not going to solve this issue with laws or panhandling laws or anything like that. It's going to be the relationship building and the resources that we connect people to. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
All right, you didn't get too long-winded, thank you. Other comments in your, again, realize these are drafts, so we'll continue to refine. Number 2 was encouraging community-wide participation in the Helpline Center's network of care. 2 specific action items out of this was 1, establish a fund. I apologize, Community Foundation is supposed to be struck from here. We don't want to focus on specific entities right now. We want to focus on deciding the fund, and then we'll decide the mechanism for how that works later. So I apologize for not taking that out. Establish a fund that incentivizes nonprofits or other agencies to participate in the Helpline network of care. So how this would be built out is over the next 3 years, we would offer nonprofits startup funds to help get them on the Helpline network of care. The first year we'd pay for 100%, second year 75%, third year 25%. So there's a monthly user fee that they have to be part of the Helpline network of care. I'm sorry? 100% first year, 75% the second year, 25% the third year. And they have monthly user fees to have a user on the Helpline network of care, et cetera. And so this would really be to encourage, I've been asked a lot by community people like Rotary and et cetera, like, what can we do, what can we do? And I think something that we could all do today is anytime anybody asks us that question is say this: you serve on a board of directors. Almost everybody here serves on a board somewhere. Next time you have a board meeting, the first question you ask should be, is our organization on the Helpline network of care, And so I think, and then following that up with saying, hey, there's resources available to help us get on that. And so that'd be the intention of this, is to really drive a community conversation about making that a possibility. So that'd be one portion of it. The second portion of it would be, and the Helpline leadership can correct me, they're in the audience today, would be there is a HIPAA compliance component of this that is new to the Helpline network of care than when the Sioux Empire network of care first started. And with that comes some extra cost. And in recognition that the Helpline has undergone a lot of extra investment, helping them over the next 3 years say, let's push the pedal to make sure that this HIPAA compliant happens, we would provide a grant directly to the Helpline network of the Helpline for their HIPAA compliance piece over the next 3 years. Sorry, that was all tongue twisted together. So that's where those 2 funds would come from. One would be a general fund for nonprofits. The second would be specifically to the Helpline for their costs. Questions on this recommendation, ideas, enhancements, et cetera? Annie?
I actually think that the $102,000 to support Helpline is pretty low, I guess, and maybe conversation with them to find out, about their work and with the federal government or the state governments, how we need to, what kind of resources we need to be able to connect the resources or the databases. Because I feel like that dollar amount's pretty low for what we need. But I'm not the expert on that piece, so, but future.
Everybody in the crowd gets nervous when a task force member wants more money, you don't only know. Andy.
I love this one. I actually like that the Community Foundation came out, just for the record. Happy to not do that. But I just wonder about, and I should have thought this earlier, if the dollars maybe are limited and hopefully there's an outpouring of organizations that want to participate, should we talk about a prioritization of those that have kind of a higher nexus with homeless populations, and so that, given a certain time frame, there would be some groups that would get the first dibs at it. That was just one thought.
That's a really good feedback. Thank you. I'll make sure to get that added in there. Terry.
So I want to start by apologizing in advance again for my lag. Again, I'm struggling to get my words out in time, just because of my experience with this. So I just want to say that I do fully support the education campaign thing too, and it's because we're not going to straight trying to enforce our way out of it. I like that our recommendations are coming forward outside of what law enforcement can do or what an ordinance can do, and an education campaign does that as well. So I do like that one as well. And I like this third one too. So both of them at once, and pardon me for the lag.
Caden?
Am I allowed to ask the Helpline Center a question?
Absolutely. If they're willing to answer.
If you would like to answer. It's an easy one, I think. I just want to learn a little bit about the tactics that you've been using to engage with new organizations and get them to come on board with you, because I fully support this and I want to make sure we get as many organizations a part of this as possible. I want to make sure that all of these organizations know this is an option for them. So maybe what kind of public education you've been doing, and what recruitment tactics you've used with organizations. Sorry to call you up.
No problem. Janet Kidham, CEO of the Helpline Center. Happy to answer questions about Network of Care. You know, when Network of Care initially launched, we had a lot of conversations and a lot of focus group meetings with the nonprofits in Sioux Falls. You know, as the Network of Care has kind of been more established, we aren't necessarily out there recruiting as hard and heavy as we had been before. There are some organizations that just come to us because they hear about it. There's other partner organizations that are involved and they also want to join. So that's probably the most that we've gotten lately, is just through word of mouth, so to speak. Yeah.
And how big of a part of the conversation is the cost associated with being a part of it? Do you feel like this would spur those individuals who have been hesitant in the past to join the Helpline Center of Care?
I do. Oftentimes the cost is part of the conversation because if we're working with a small nonprofit, it sometimes is a burden for their budget for them to be able to afford the user fees and the ongoing cost. So I do believe the incentive of a fund would encourage nonprofit agencies to join, especially those, as Andy talked about, that are more in touch with basic needs or the homeless population. That's really, I think, what the target is here.
Mm-hmm. Janet, can you just share with us what is the user fee? What is it a month? What happens when they sign on?
Sure. So there's an MOU that we have all of our partner agencies sign when they join.
Member operating agreement, right?
Sorry, MOU. Sorry, as member of operating of understanding. So we work with a software company called VisionLink, which helps us to have the platform for the Network of Care. With the VisionLink, it's a pass-through cost from them. So each end user has to have a unique end user, and so there's a fee that we have to pay directly to that software company. That fee is right around $30 a month. That potentially the cost will go up as we become HIPAA compliant, however, for that. So if an agency has 3 staff members, each staff member needs a unique user ID, and they have to pay that fee. So that is not a fee that the Helpline Center is benefiting from, which is a pass-through cost. We're sending that on. And then when an agency starts with the Helpline Center, we do charge an initial startup fee because we have to invest our staff time to build the platform to meet the needs of whatever that organization has, whatever programs and services and data that they want to track. So there is, and sometimes that fee varies a little bit based upon the complexity of that nonprofit organization. So sometimes we don't know that fee exactly till we get in and we have to actually build the software to meet their needs. Does that help? Great.
Other questions? Mike?
What would that final fee be on average?
You know, the startup fee is usually around a couple $1,000s. Sometimes like that varies, as I've said. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Janet.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. The other action item here that's on for the Helpline Network of Care then relates back to something Jesse talked about earlier and something Annie mentioned as well, is really hosting a roundtable discussion with other key leaders across the city and state regarding HMIS, Helpline Network of Care, et cetera. Depending upon how those conversations continue, that could impact then other needs regarding Helpline Network of Care. But just to kind of emphasize why this is important, take what Jesse said. I think many of us have been involved in nonprofit communities. If you've got a front desk person that's intaking an individual and that front desk person has to enter something on Excel, Microsoft Access, and the Helpline Network of Care, all of a sudden, it's kind of like, I'm going to choose whichever one is easiest, so I'm not going to enter it on the other one. All of a sudden, the data is no longer live. The data is no longer helpful to the other agencies. And so that's why it's so important that we have these conversations, is that agencies aren't going to use multiple databases just regarding the health of their staff and efficiency of operations. So that's the thought pattern of why we're promoting these conversations and why it might lead to other action. Other questions on this priority? Third item on here was to enter into formal planning with the county to strengthen housing first with wraparound services strategy to grow over the next 3 years. I think we've had a lot of conversation about this. There's been focus on saying, what can we do to get people in housing the fastest? I believe an article was shared with all of us early on in this process of what they're doing in Houston regarding housing first. Basically, in a sense, master leases where you get individuals in places as soon as you can under case management. A similar model to like the safe home strategy, but maybe more not building focused as much as just citywide focused. And so the conversation here is say, hey, let's enter into formal conversations with the county, recognizing the county's engaged in a lot of this. And so there's not specifics that we know at this juncture on there. We say we need to have formal conversation about it. There is an item on here that's undergoing that's extremely important. That's called the Just Home Project. The county and the city are working. They've received funds regarding individuals that have experience in criminal justice or have been impacted by the criminal justice system and how to help with that housing. And there's uncertainty still of how that's all going to unfold and roll out in our community. And so those conversations need to happen and get a little further down the road before we can go further down the road in our conversation. But what I've heard from all of you and from others in the community is that people want this to be a priority to update and to take our conversations with the county to the next level. So questions on this, comments or refinements on this?
Well, I think, Rich, we have seen great results with our first wet house. You know, I know initially it wasn't supported by really anybody other than the county. They were big believers in it. I know law enforcement was a big fan, and I think we've all come around that it's a good place, and it keeps chronic people off the street and gives them the dignity of a place to live in the midst of wherever it is that they are at. We just don't have enough of that space. And however we roll that out to more people, you know, it's the same size facility 10 years in, and we're not the same size community. We're not the same size city, we're not the same size counties, we're not the same size state. So I think we need to figure out how to make it fit for where we are at today.
Great, thank you. Other comments or questions, refinements? Final recommendation on here then is to encourage the council to review the loitering ordinance with law enforcement, city's attorney's office, and other impacted individuals. We had the chief again with us today, reviewing panhandling specifically. We've heard a lot of different comments on this in the community, and there's just not clarity at the moment, and so there needs to be continued conversation between attorneys, law enforcement, and so forth. And I think what I've heard from this group, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that what I've heard from this group is that we don't want to leave this task force with this as our only recommendation and say to the community, we're just changing one rule, but we recognize that this is part of it as well, that we got to make sure our laws are reflective of what the law enforcement needs to do their job and helpful for the community overall. So I see this as a both and, not a, hey, let's not touch our laws, but also it's not a law only issue. Is that reflective of what I'm hearing and how we want to proceed on that front? Marshall?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think this one's tricky because since I've been on the council and that too, sometimes you hear about there's only so much you can do with that ordinance and the loitering, and sometimes I don't know, it's been back and forth and it goes through legal. So as far as what we can actually do there, I think you summed that up well, but hopefully we can move the needle again, like the whole thing with this committee, move the needle a little bit, but you know, how many calls do we take as counselors on the panhandling and this and that, and then there's only so much you can do, and if we can do anything, but then you have to explain that to folks, what is the law and how do we move it, or can we? So again, just even that answer I just gave talked in circles about the whole thing as hard as it is. So
all right, Does that kind of summarize? I believe we've had general majority agreement on those 4 overarching. Now, there might be some individuals individually there, whatever, but we've had general agreement on those 4. Am I understanding that correctly? So then the next 3 on here are things that have been what I'm going to call side conversations, come up in different venues, come up in the main venue here at different times. 3 different things that have really popped up multiple times in different ways with community members. First one is the conversation we had earlier about the temporary warming shelter. I believe we're going to move forward with the plan of Jim's going to follow up with all of us in about 10 days after Carrie continues to work this winter preparedness plan. But what I heard from this group is crystal clear. We want to have a conversation again in 2 weeks if there's not a clear plan, because we do not want Bishop Dudley to be on an island. I think I've heard that crystal clear from this group. We want to support in that way. Second item that's come up from multiple of you and different individuals in the community that, to be honest, wasn't even on my radar screen when this started. Many people have said to me throughout the last couple of months, they've said, Rich, everything you're talking about for the most part is reactionary. What are you doing to change the trajectory in 15 to 20 years versus today? And I believe Annie has had some maybe even more frank comments to me than that on the situation. But overall, so anyhow, what's come from that is different people in the community have said, hey, very specifically again, 78% of our homeless population is Native American. What are we doing to partner with the Native American community to change the trajectory of our Native American youth in our city and state? Again, a very difficult conversation, and you don't want to point out one specific group over other groups, etc., but it's come up in multiple avenues, and so there's been questions about, is there anything we can do to strengthen state partnerships when children are moving from the city to the reservation or to other communities to make sure they're staying in school? Is there things we can do locally to make sure that our Native American graduation rates improve? To be frank, and as I've thought more about this, it's, in Sioux Falls, we're great at saying, hey, the basement's flooding. Everybody come over and help with the basement. And everybody comes over and helps, but rarely do we say, why is the basement flooding? And so what can we do looking out a ways? That's where this kind of came from. I don't know where this is going, but I wanted to put this on there that this conversation has come up in different things. If anybody's got specific ideas here, not today since this is kind of the first time, but after this, if you've got thoughts or things like that, I would encourage you to email me. We can set up some further conversation, but that's where that's come from, and it's come up multiple times. The other item on here that's come up multiple times, and we do not have a majority agreement on the task force and talking with everybody individually. There's been a lot of conversations about identification, whether it be birth certificate, driver's license. Should we be involved with trying to create a clearer process for how individuals get that? Should we be involved in encouraging the state legislature to make something happen like that? And what I've heard individually from people's feedback is we don't have agreement on that as a task force. Again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just putting here what I've been hearing from feedback, everyone on that piece. So I'm not taking it completely off of here, but I'm struggling to find the unity on our group of a specific way to move it forward at this time. So does that make sense why I kind of put it there in that spot? Yes.
This is a question for Annie, just because I think you might be able to shed some light on this, and if not, I apologize, but I think that just because of your tenure with the county, the Salvation Army warming shelter was before my time. Can you shed some light on what worked, what didn't work about that? I don't know if you feel comfortable commenting on what your thoughts are on that, but...
I thought we were talking about IDs.
Oh, no, I'm working on that.
Oh, okay. Well, the warming shelter, I think we had a lot of issues with the neighborhood, and it wasn't a permanent solution either. It's just a big warm room. Yeah, and we didn't have people that maybe were experienced or educated in the social services realm. Terry alluded to some of that, I think, earlier. So I think if we can use the resources that we have that are specialized in this type of service, that's going to be the best.
So those are kind of what I'm going to say. Oh, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
I'm actually going to interject for both Kelly and for Caden. First of all, I agree with you, Kelly. The things being that, there wasn't any, social work kind of background type of people there. But secondarily, I'm one of those that, unfortunately, that does not. I do precede that time, and I did stay there. And to be very honest with you, when we're going into deep winter, when it's extremely cold, when nobody really cares if there's social work right there. Yeah, not having them there maybe presents some particular problems or concerns, but on the other hand, when it comes down to saving someone's life from dying out in the cold, that has to be taken into effect as well.
Thank you. Okay, any final comments on those three things that we're kind of saying? There's not agreement at the moment, kind of been on the radar, and different things to converse about. Jesse?
I just recall hearing that that it was a potentially unsafe situation. If a single parent had a child of the opposite sex that was 13 years old. So I'm a mother, and I have a 13 and a 15-year-old son. I stay in one room, and my boys go to a different room. And it's somewhat of a free-for-all because it's an emergency warming shelter. I think that's why a lot of people chose to stay in their cars, and because they didn't feel comfortable being separated from their children, and felt like they were perhaps endangering them by having them be in a group that was somewhat of a free-for-all. Not by anybody's fault or choice. It was the nature of how it worked.
Thank you.
And if I'm wrong in that, Annie, correct me, but.
Well, I think if that was the situation, the county, if they knew about it, they would actually assist that family to not stay at those places. So.
Actually, the thing is, while I was there, when it was an ongoing process, the families weren't split up. It was one big gymnasium room. And to be very honest with you, as has been stated before, I think it was by John, the chief of police, these people do particularly make their own community. And every time when I was in that particular environment, and we're speaking specifically of the Salvation Army, there were people there that would protect anyone else. Just from my personal experience.
Thank you. So then the final items on here, these final three items were kind of identifying as, these are priorities that the council and the mayor need to be aware of, but also recognize that there's conversation happening in the community. And so it'd be, I'm sure inappropriate, it's too strong of a word, but it wouldn't be the appropriate time to make action in there when there's other conversations going on. So for example, those three things specifically are mental health has been discussed a lot. And we've had conversations with the link. I know that I have multiple individual conversations. Our research team had really good long conversation with the leadership there. There's just conversations at the link right now regarding their service in the mental health space as well, from when they first started to today and their ongoing plan there. And so we need to let that strategic planning unfold. Second item that's been discussed a lot is housing our homeless families. We know that Bishop Dudley and other organizations are in conversation regarding potential of housing families at the old current existing Children's Inn facility, and want those conversations to unfold a little bit further to see where that goes. And then there's been also this conversation about just creating more housing units in our community, that we need more housing units created and the recognition that Thrive's Housing Action Team is in the process of working on a potential housing trust fund. We need to let that play out further for them to bring some definition to that before the city potentially would have a recommendation of being involved in funding, whatever that might be. There's not clarity at this time in what that looks like, but we need that team to continue to do its work. So how this is laid out, over the next week, you'd receive back those top 4 recommendations in more of a formal, hey, this is what the task force would be recommending to the council and the mayor, and the others would be attached as notes saying conversations were had around this, ideas were shared about this, but there's no formal recommendations at this time. So at our next meeting, you'd be asked to vote on those 4 recommendations that we're making and authorize the release of those notes to the council and the mayor. So over the next 2 weeks, we'll send that out again. You'll have an opportunity to refine further. We'll gather again in 2 weeks, and that time we can discuss further, enhance, et cetera. At that point, we will be taking a formal vote to pass that recommendation on. And again, emphasizing it's a recommendation to the council and the mayor that they'll have further conversation and work to do. And then the final piece to remember is that there'll be a lot of public input between the time that this is formally recommended and the council and the mayor act upon it. The council can't act on anything without public input, and the public will have opportunity to give input throughout that as well. Questions on how this is going to unfold over the next couple of weeks? Comments? Marshall?
Just a comment. Thank you for your leadership on this. Rich, it's been terrific. Being a part of this, you know, task force, it's just such an overwhelming topic, and you're always kind of like, you know, there's been 100 studies done on this, and you know, as we form this group, people would go, well, why are we doing this? Isn't there already a bunch of studies? Why aren't we just doing what's been out there? Well, you've done a really nice job of getting the group together and forming these tasks, and I appreciate the group that's here that's been on these meetings, and you've just done a nice job of kind of tying it together. What we're hoping to do is move the needle just a hair. And I think you've put us in that direction. So nice job, and thank you to all of you folks that are involved with this. It's overwhelming, but I think we're moving in a little bit, and you're all doing terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Marshall. Terry?
I'll just add a comment in regards to the complexity of the issue, and certainly recognizing that we will be faced with dealing with mental health and addiction and trauma. And I just really like what Annie said earlier with her story about that connection she made. And as a trauma educator, we often always say that healing happens in relationships. So if we can get our community to realize that the way we really move the needle on this is helping homeless people heal from stuff and supporting efforts that are relationship centric, that's a step in the right direction, and we're doing some of that with our recommendations.
Other questions before we dismiss today? Annie?
Just one last comment. Marshall, I think I was one of the people that said those things. And if you notice on our list here, it is a lot of work that's already being done in the community. It's just now the city council has more of a part of it. So that's exciting.
Thank you, Annie, for pouring in for so many years. Okay, well, with all of that, thank you, Task Force, for your continued work. Would really appreciate your conversation over the next 2 weeks. We'll meet, correct, Jim, 2 weeks from today? Same time, same place, same people?
If that works for everyone's schedule, yeah, we could just schedule it out 2 weeks.
Perfect time, lower the temperature. All right, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Thank you, public.